Hello, my name is Molly Ilbrock, and I am the Director of Corporate Communications at ESMT Berlin. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's open lecture, Made in China 2025, a presentation and discussion around the recent Foundation for Defense of Democracies report, Made in Germany, co-opted by China. We are hosting this event together with the American Embassy in Berlin. A special thanks to Esme Ellis and Isaac Martin of the American Embassy for their great cooperation. Today's moderator is China expert, Professor Frank Hammel. Professor Hammel is a certified IP lawyer with Weitnauer in Berlin. He advises nationally and internationally operating companies on intellectual property, copyright, as well as competition and antitrust law. Please use the Q&A to ask your questions today, as we will have time for questions towards the end of the presentation. With no further ado, I would like to turn over to Professor Hammel, who will introduce our speakers. Frank, the floor is yours.
Okay, good evening, guten Abend, Wan Shang Hao. I highly appreciate having the opportunity to guide you through today's lecture. Thank you, Molly, for the warm introduction and for hosting and organizing this lecture. Actually, you made a brilliant job by choosing the topic of tonight's lecture, Made in Germany, co-opted by China, but as well as by choosing the right point of time for this lecture. 3 weeks ago, the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, pushed the EU-China investment deal over the finish line. Last Monday, January 18th, the new Chinese foreign investment regulations took effect, issued by the MOFCOM, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, introducing mandatory principles of foreign investment review pre-closing. Last Thursday, January 21st, the new American President, Joe Biden, came into office, ending the policy of America First. Yesterday, January 25th, the Chinese President, Xi Jinping, delivered a speech at the World Economic Forum, addressing the issue of globalization and proclaiming smooth transfer of R&D. And tonight, we have the opportunity to reflect on those recent events, together with our two distinguished US-based researchers, Emily de la Bruyère and Nathan Picarsic. Let me shortly introduce to you our special guests. Emily de la Bruyère. She's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, FDD. Her academic background is a BA from Princeton University and an MA from Sciences Po Paris. She is contributing to FDD Center of Economic and Financial Power, CFFP, and she pioneered novel data collection and analysis tools, and she has extensive Chinese language research and program management experience. Impressive, truly impressive. Beside her, Nathan Picarsic. He is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies as well. His academic background is a BA from Harvard College, and he completed executive education programs through Harvard Business School and the Defense Acquisition University. He is contributing to FDD's CFP as well, and he is at the cutting edge of US analysis of China's policy. What else do we want tonight? Before I give the floor to our experts, I would like to ask you as our audience to make extensive use of the Q&A feature of Zoom. Please do not hesitate to post your preferably short questions, because I have to read them out, and giving me the chance afterwards to confront our experts with your questions. So, the floor is yours. Are you starting, Emily, or are you starting, Nathan?
I'll kick off very quickly, and Emily will provide much smarter commentaries than what I can offer. But first, would just like to thank you, Professor Hammel, thank Molly, ESMT, the whole team that has coordinated this event, and we're grateful for all of the participants who have joined us for, as you framed, Professor Hammel, what we think is a very timely and important conversation. So I'll introduce ourselves just quickly before turning the floor over to Emily. As you mentioned, we're a part of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where we're senior fellows in the China program. FDD is a nonpartisan research institute based in Washington, D.C. that focuses on foreign policy and international security challenges, and we're very much excited for this opportunity to engage with the audience today, because a core pillar of FDD's work and our own research is focusing on multilateral opportunities for engaging on new and emerging threats in the security and economic environments globally. And clearly Germany stands as a keystone in European policy and security, as well as the global equivalents. So thank you for this opportunity. And we're excited to discuss some of our key findings on the industrial plan Made in China 2025, as well as the more topical and timely implications that we think the Chinese orientation toward global competition generates in terms of the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, broader EU-China relations and EU-US relations, as well as the normative and moral obligations that we see to confront some of the human rights risks and abuses that seem apparent with China's model, both at home and abroad. With that, I'll turn it over to Emily to offer some summary remarks on our paper focused on Made in China.
Thank you, Nate, and reiterating all of Nate's thanks. As Nate suggested, I'm going to start with a brief overview of our report's findings and framings, and then we'll look more specifically at the implications of those in the context of the recent EU-China investment agreement, as well as increasingly salient and glaring human rights questions. So broadly, we found in parsing Chinese discourse about the present international landscape and China's ambitions therein, a particular focus on Europe, and within Europe on Germany. That because of its scale, its influence, its degree of technological and economic advance, Europe will be the critical swing vote in China's bid to redefine the global architecture. Also that where Germany leads, Europe is likely to follow. To that end, China targets Germany and does so along three primary dimensions. First, Germany is a source of technology and influence to fuel China's asymmetric techno-economic approach. Second, Germany is a partner to be won over in Beijing's bid to set international standards and define the global architecture. Finally, Germany is a competitor, one to be overtaken as China establishes a dominant position in the global system. This framing, its ends and its means are largely commercially, industrially, economically oriented. They also have to be understood within the larger context of Beijing's global techno-economic playbook. The CCP's international strategy hinges on capturing the modern networks, technical standards, and platforms that are going to govern the 21st century. The idea is that a new international architecture is being formed as a result of today's industrial revolution. That the last time such a redefinition took place, it was led by the US and Europe, allowing them to lead to dominate the following decades. And at the next beat, that today's new industrial revolution, today's new redefinition of the architecture provides an opportunity for Beijing to leapfrog the US and Europe, to compensate for its institutional disadvantage in the 20th century and acquire that same sort of systemic power in the 21st. To that end, the CCP exploits partnerships with foreign companies, governments, and institutions to siphon technology, gain market share, and accumulate coercive leverage that is then used to set rules, systems, norms. Germany's technological edge and its global influence make it particularly valuable for this ambition. Beijing operationalizes its approach by trading short-term benefits. to corporate and government actors in the form, for example, of investment or favorable joint ventures in exchange for its longer-term strategic positioning. And of course, in many cases, the long-term disadvantage of those with whom it's trading. The high-speed rail industry offers a legacy, concrete, technological/industrial example. In a similar field, electric vehicles offer a more emerging one. But this point extends also to newer architectural areas, potentially with more influence. Telecommunications are a hot buzzwordy example as China competes for 5G. Less exciting, less buzzwordy, but equally foundational are port logistics, which we also talk about in our report. Overall, these are the industry chains and the technological systems that are going to decide how resources moving forward. If China can set them, it can potentially control the movement of those resources. And on that front, Nate, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Emily, are you finished?
I'm going to hand it over to Nate briefly for the next section, or if he's having...
Nathan? Is he on? I can't see him.
He might be having connectivity issues. Quick reorganization we're going to conduct. So that was like the power balance example. Another critical thing that emerges here and is increasingly salient is the divide over international norms and human rights, and the need for multilateral US-Germany, US-Europe, really just global partnerships in pushing against China's human rights oppression at home, and then what that means for the international system. Because it's a very tangible example, we want to look very quickly at the case of forced labor and what it means for international industrial systems and modes. There is, as is increasingly common knowledge, a pervasive program of forced labor within China, with Xinjiang, the home of the majority of the Uyghur minority population, as a particular node within that. But this forced labor program really extends throughout the entire country. And because of China's industrial influence and integration internationally, the rest of the world ends up building industry on top of that forced labor. The solar industry chain is a very good example here. China controls about 70% of polysilicon, which is the upstream input necessary to produce solar panels. The next beat, which is turning that polysilicon into wafers and ingots, China controls north of 90%. Most of that polysilicon production takes place in Xinjiang and appears to have connections to a number of indicators of forced labor. And what that means is that as the world is pivoting towards this new form of energy, that entire supply chain for that energy risks being built on forced labor and on approaches to human rights that are antithetical to, Western democratic norms. And that's just the industrial example, which is, by the way, pervasive throughout other industry chains. There's also the IT more emerging example, for which this forced labor, but also similar public security concerns emerge, and which suggests we might not only be building on oppressive systems, but also be deploying information technology systems that have the potential to influence the way people act, the way they think, the way they communicate, but doing so according to an authoritarian set of norms. So what does this mean? There's new attention to this question. There are the beginnings of increased scrutiny to, for example, imports and investments that might be linked to forced labor and other human rights investment or human rights abuses. But there's a larger question here, which is what role and what possibility there is for US-Germany, US-Europe for multilateral action that really addresses these abuses and forms mechanisms through which the emerging global system, to go back to that concept, can be built in a way that aligns with our international norms. And on this front, I will now segue once more to Nate, in what might actually be a more logical progression, to talk about the investment agreement.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you again for the chance to contribute to this dialogue. As Professor Hammel introduced at the outset, this is happening in a particularly timely moment because of the recent comprehensive agreement on investment between the EU and China, and the issues that Emily just defined in terms of asymmetries between the Chinese and Western democratic approach to governance, to technology, to industry, I think figure prominently in the way that agreements like the CAI can come together and can be an opportunity for redressing some of the competitive advantage that China seizes. So the CAI itself is an opportunity to address the human rights abuses and to generate enforceable terms and conditions that allow for monitoring these types of abuses within China and for imposing costs to deter their proliferation more broadly than they already exist. At the same time, these also agreements like the CAI offer an opportunity to redress the very practical economic asymmetries that exist. So when we think about the industrial orientation that we've documented in the Made in China 2025 report, we think of a whole host of structural asymmetries between the Chinese system and that of the global ecosystem that it engages. So China's relatively centralized as an industrial actor compared to the Western world. China has a relative capacity for subsidizing its peers through government investment relative to its Western peers. It takes a long-term view relative to its Western peers, and its industry supports holistic national goals in a more cohesive fashion than its Western peers. And here we point to programs like military civil fusion as an example for how that industrial centralization supports security ambitions. And this whole host of asymmetries are advantages that can be redressed or balanced through international agreements like the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. And we think it critical in moments like the present to account for standard setting in technology, standard setting in norms and values, like when we discuss the forced labor risks, but also to defend the long-term economic interests of the industrial champions that have brought Germany to the position that it is in as the keystone of European economic growth, because the most sort of operative or threatening asymmetry is this one wherein the Chinese approach to engagement with the fragmented open global system forces a trade-off between long-term strategic positioning in exchange for short-term profits. So the investment agreement offers an opportunity for firms to increase engagement either through inbound investment from Chinese peers or market access on the Chinese side. But if that is not paired with those sort of promotional and additive measures, if those are not paired with protective measures as well, you would anticipate seeing a replication of the Siemens high-speed rail scenario where Chinese actors are able to leverage forced technology transfer, leverage the inducement of market access in China to gain their own competitive edge, which over some period of time they mature domestically before promoting and proliferating globally at the expense of the technological innovators and industrial champions in the West who previously were dominant in these fields. And again, we see this dynamic at risk of proliferating in an order of magnitude because of the centralized approach that China has taken, because of the strategic orientation and prioritization that Chinese industrial policy imposes on its actors. And when we see moments like the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment and others that could follow in the future, they are the modes of competition, if you will. These are the battlefields that will determine whether China's goal of seizing the commanding heights is realized, or whether Western democratic norms win out over the autocratic and techno-totalitarian alternatives that China offers. And that's why we're excited for the opportunity to discuss with this audience in particular, because you're at the keystone of EU's economic vitality and a group of well-read and well-positioned individuals who will go out into the world and we hope continue to pursue long-term economic growth, which again, we think is often put at risk by the industrial policy and alternative vision that the Chinese Communist Party deploys through its Made in China 2025 plan. And with that, I'll stop rambling and turn over to Professor Hammel. Thank you again.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Nathan, once again for the great presentation. To my mind, your research study is really sharp as the eagle's eye. And I think we should now take the opportunity to discuss the issues you already addressed. Unfortunately, you answered already my first question I prepared as an icebreaker question on the EU-China investment deal. But there are some other interesting questions I prepared as well. So let me start with one issue, the China standard setting strategy issue on intelligent manufacturing. 2012, the US proposed the Industry Interconnection Plan. 2030, Germany proposed the Industry 4.0 strategy. In 2015, China responded launching MIC 2025. What do you think? Can the Western world win by fair means a race on standard setting? Although China has the biggest national market, plus the Asian market, plus the Belt and Road states, and although China has more academic capital, 100 times more BA and MA students each year than the Western world?
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, such an excellent framing of the question. And I mean, two key thrusts of the way you put it that I think are worth teasing out. The first is the idea that China's Made in China 2025 plan was not in its own right new. It largely built on, and this is, explicit and admitted in Chinese discussions of it, it largely built on a precedent established by European and US planning that recognized the Industrial Revolution underway and then created plans to address it. The difference is, per Chinese discussion of this, though, that Made in China 2025, unlike those, focuses more on the international standards, architecture, and systems being formed than on the specific technologies or capacities within those. And that, as such, it could take advantage of the other plans and then the technologies developed as a result of them in other countries in order to populate the system being built according to Made in China 2025 internationally. We have this quote in the report about China's relationship to the US and Germany as they advance their own Industry 4.0 type plans, which is that they can engage as in a horse race, and China can effectively let themselves take each other out, tire each other out, push themselves to develop technologies, whereas sitting on the sidelines, China can carefully craft a system, the very system in which these horses are racing. So that's the first beat of your question, which I think is critically important. This is not an unrecognized revolution, but it's one that China is going about differently and in a way that might give it an asymmetric advantage. But you also pointed to other advantages that are largely structural ones from which China benefits and that have unique relevance in today's present competition, which include, for example, China's size in terms of user base and population, but also simply economic mass. And those are such critical inputs, and obviously always have been, but are particularly critical in the standard setting and network-based competition, because size can be a more determinative input in modern competitions than it necessarily ever has before. And precisely because of the kind of systemic versus technological advancement asymmetry that we've already talked about, size can be more determinative in input than necessarily innovative capacity, which has been the key one in the past. And that puts China at a massive advantage. That's also why it's so important for us to be speaking here all together today, because Europe, Germany, the US, we can rival China's size, but through multilateralism. And based on the current structural advantages that we enjoy, as well as the size and the scope that we can enjoy if acting in concert, there is a real competitive possibility. However, it requires actually acting in concert, and it requires understanding the value of standards and international architectures in today's contest.
Thanks a lot. Nathan, do you want to add something? No. Okay, then let's put it in a little bit bigger picture. As you all know, in November of last year, the RCEP trade agreement was signed. This is an agreement of 14 states, the ASEAN states plus Australia. They concluded a free trade agreement, establishing a market comprising nearly 30% of the global trade, regulating custom tariffs, regulating investment and IP issues. The German Federal Ministry of Commerce considers this trade agreement a wake-up call for the globalization. What's your position on it?
I mean, I think that's exactly right. And I think that the reason for wake up and recognition of expansion of regional trade agreements, which we think there may be, several to follow, is this very point of scope and scale that Emily defined, and access to the Chinese market as a potential determinative feature for China's approach to these types of agreements. So if China is able to establish a regional trading bloc and make it easier for Chinese investment, Chinese IP protections, and Chinese access relative to those of German or other Western potential exporters to those countries or investors into those countries, China may seize something of a dominant advantage because we'll be fighting on multiple fronts to be able to gain access to the Chinese market, and then also fighting from positions of relative weakness to retain access to other key Asian trading blocs. So I think as we see it, the key opportunities, again, to underscore this theme of multilateralism lie in engaging directly with ASEAN, engaging directly with Japan and South Korea, as well as Australia, to underscore the both the normative and human rights values that we have in agreement and have for the past 70 years, but also to understand where these agreements present risks in terms of the consolidation of supply chains, in terms of intellectual property theft and forced technology transfer vis-a-vis China. And we see China as an outlier in terms of its observed behavior on those fronts. So there's no intellectual property theft and thief in the world on par with China. There's no single state advancing a centralized technical standard strategy, but for China. So this very much is a wake-up call if those objectives and means are baked into regional trade agreements, bilateral or multilateral. As they pile up, they compound the competitive disadvantage that those in the West face in trying to retain positions in those markets, let alone gain new positions in those markets.
Thank you. Let's look at from the different perspective. There's a saying attributed to Napoleon, China is a sleeping lion, let China sleep, from when it awakes, it will shake the world. If you put it in your context of your research paper, Is it a short-term, mid-term, or long-term strategy to slow down the process of closing the technology gap by China? Is it an option?
Thank you. And that, I mean, that line is so apt, and that it predates hiding and biding is pretty remarkable. So the first beat I just want to hit on is that the past year in particular, let's say past 5 years more broadly, have been remarkable for watching China wake up, or at least wake up from feigned slumber. There's no question that all the efforts have been being made in the background over the past decades, but having diagnosed itself as in a new position of global power, influence, leverage, China's throwing off the cloak, and that's only going to increase. And it means that the real power, again, influence, leverage that China has is likely significantly greater than what we imagine, because so much of it has been hidden or obscured for so long. But that's then also, it's not only the hiding and the biding, apologies, it's also the nature of China's strategy. Beijing doesn't use military tools per se. It begins with an industrial and a technological and a largely peacetime approach to competition, and one that manipulates cooperation rather than being outwardly competitive, even though it's with a competitive ambition. And that further lulls us to a significant degree into sleep, because we're watching a dynamic play out in what to our minds are traditionally competitive domains or peacetime domains, and we have to square that circle with a new framework in which that's where the international competition currently lies. So, I mean, short term, medium term, long term, the very immediate is refining our framework, understanding that in the present, to forgive the buzzword, globalized era, competition plays out in what have in the past been cooperative or peacetime domains, and that's what conflict is. Then built on that, there are a range of defensive and offensive mechanisms that have to be deployed according to a taxonomy that takes into account how easy they are to do in the immediate versus medium long term. On the defensive mode, with technology theft a problem to the extent that it is, but also with the difficulty of protecting it in a globalized system as high as it is, we have to really be able to carve out those technologies that can be protected and that are strategically significant enough to be. The longer term mechanism is, rather than playing that whack-a-mole game of defense, we redefine global systems and mechanisms to hold players who steal technology, for example, accountable. There's a whole new wave of accountability mechanisms that, while in theory programmed into existing institutional architectures, China has been able to manipulate or neuter or circumvent, not just in technology, but also, for example, in trade law or human rights, and that it's up to the international system now to sit together and redefine in a way that can hold China accountable. So the short term, long term on that defensive angle is immediate protection versus building a system that can actually ensure accountability. On the proactive or offensive angle, this is where there's a new set of foundational industries taking form. In the long term, especially in the US, in the short term, especially in the US, there's an absolute need to invest in their development and scaling, because we might be in a good place technologically, but not in a great place in terms of actually building and deploying infrastructures. Also short term is, again, forming a mechanism by which our allies and partners can sit together and do this together and agree on systems that are mutually agreeable moving forward. The longer term is actually deploying this new architecture and in a way that aligns with global interests and norms. So that's a very, high level abstract answer, but I think that's the taxonomy along which we think about developing these plans moving forward.
Yeah. Thank you, Emily. But to me, it sounds a little bit academic from the IP side, because most of the relevant US and EU IP is in the civil sector and belongs to companies in the private sector. Yeah? So the question is, to what extent do we believe that US and EU governments are capable to influence decision makers of globalized companies in the private sector to abstain from joint ventures with Chinese companies or Asian companies as such? Today I attended a meeting, an expert meeting in the Deutsche Bundestag, House of Parliament, and there was a fraction of the German car making industry. They actually produce 5 million cars per annum, per year. And that's in China. And that's more of production than they have here in Germany. So they put the local content to China. So can you give him an argument how to influence those decision makers not to jump the boat?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the operative and most compelling argument has to be one based upon economics. And I think that the asymmetry at play that needs to be engaged with is the one of timescales. So these companies often will be making their decisions based on generating efficiencies for a quarterly return. If you're to orient away from the quarterly or annual basis and focus more on the longer term prospects for your enterprise, you may realize that you're sowing the seeds of your own demise by engaging with access to technology and markets with Chinese peers who, quite frankly, will not be satisfied to remain your junior partner and ally moving forward. At the opportune moment, they will seize the chance to leapfrog. And in the auto sector, I think we're probably likely about to see that happen, where the shift to EVs is going to provide an opportunity where Chinese players are going to seize higher value add segments of production. They're going to do it in their market. That's going to generate jobs in their market. And ultimately, that's going to generate more profits that flow back to Chinese concerns than to their traditional Western and often German partners who have invested heavily and will be in a position to need returns. But as China seizes this leapfrog toward EVs, there's a very severe risk, I think, that you'll see 5 and 10-year prospects of German champions beginning to diminish at the same time that you'll see the market capitalization and long-term futures for their Chinese partners who 5 years ago, some of which didn't exist, and were certainly considered the junior peers in this global sector. They're slowly, gradually coming to be on par, and they are going to seize this opportunity to leapfrog, and it will impact the long-term viability and certainly the medium-term profits of companies that are partnering with them.
Thank you. Another short question from my side before we turn over to the audience about the title of your research paper. The line "made in" is considered as a badge of origin. And historically, this badge of origin was used by the British government to brand German products as copies with bid quality, as you know. Did you have historical background in mind by phrasing the title, or the new perception as a quality brand?
Yes, of course, and I think that this. I think there's actually something in the Chinese side where we'll see that the origin label means more than the brand itself. So they are quite happy to have Lotus cars in the future come out with a "Made in China" origin label somewhere tucked below. So I think both the history in terms of implications in the EU, we hope are resonant and draw attention. And then we think that there's also something that's a bit of a nuance and just the value assigned to this origin debate in China and how we think they value the origin stamp and label more than they value the brand of the good that goes out into the world. And I think it's also resonant in the United States as an active piece of U.S. industrial reaction to some of the weaknesses that we've seen in a time of crisis of COVID. So I think we're not fearful of engaging with the loaded nature of these terms because it's important and a key feature of how China thinks about their industrial approach.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the answer. So let's turn now to the numerous questions I got by the audience. Let's start with the latest one. China seems to be aiming at running the country as a gigantic venture capital project. Can and will it work? Who will answer?
I'll jump in. I think that's a fantastic framing, and I think one that speaks to some of the asymmetries we've highlighted. Again, to be a broken record here, the time scale. So they're not looking to have their returns in a quarter. They're looking at a 3 to 5 to 10-year time horizon and placing bets. The difference that I would point out between and why I think that they may, have higher chances of succeeding than any, individual venture capital firm, is that they're not placing like high risk or risk acceptant bets. They're sitting downstream of the risky segments of research and development to siphon technology, and they're placing their bets. They are placing bets the way functionally a venture capitalist might. And they're hoping that a diversified set of 10 of these bets may generate 3 or 5 home runs, but they're placing them with really complete information because of their illicit access to technology and information flows, because of the inducement of their market, because of the licit arrangements that they have in terms of joint ventures and global investment. So they're picking their sectors and they're placing their bets on champions and on technology, not in the traditional sense that a venture capitalist might, that's early stage and people are working in a garage and we don't know if any of this will work. They're downstream and they know what will work, and they're focusing on not innovating in the fundamental science or technology that we might be thinking about, but focusing on innovating in terms of using their core strengths to apply technology. So their core strengths of the size of their market, the size of their domestic user base, and the degree to which those are protected relative to their peers outside. So I think it's a fantastic framing, a fantastic question, and one that we should continue to grapple with. And for those reasons, these asymmetries in the way that they approach innovation and applying vice, investing in basic research and development or science technology, I'm fearful or concerned that they may have a higher chance to be a top 10% VC return profile with lower risk.
Hey, thanks a lot. Actually, we got the first question on the speech of Xi Jinping on the World Economic Forum. Let's put it this way. Imagine you're invited by President Biden to visit together Beijing and to meet President Xi Jinping. What would you tell or ask President Xi Jinping with respect to his speech yesterday at the Economic Forum? Any idea? Because he addressed several times the phrase Cold War. Is he actually expecting that the Western hemisphere is beating back now, or what's the expectation?
I might answer, but somewhat aside, because I think that Cold War framing is critical on any number of levels. I mean, the first is that as we look at it, just from an analytical perspective, this is not the world of the Cold War. And therefore, while yes, we are in a long-term peacetime competition, the Cold War model doesn't apply, and it's not going to apply because the world is integrated in a way that it was not in the Cold War, because as you've already pointed out, and this is a corollary, multinational corporations, the private sector, the civil sector have a degree of influence and power and presence that they did not have during the Cold War. And therefore, the framework, the modes, the nature of this competition are going to be entirely different. And I think we risk falling into this analytical trap where we say, oh, it's a long-term peacetime competition. It involves something of a bipolar layout, Cold War. And Chinese sources are very much aware of this and talk about this in great detail, especially as they talk about what this means for how to compete, which, going back to our original framing, means that because China does not contain itself, China can take advantage of international resources, whether that's, for example, acquiring technology from Germany, or, for example, investing in sources of critical raw materials, cobalt in the DRC, that are then going to be foundational for supply chains of dominant industries moving forward. And that's competition through integration, which was not the mode of the Cold War. Similarly, the way, according to the Chinese framing, one wins this present contest is by defining the rules of the globalized architecture. So you compete through integration, and then you compete for that integration, if you will. That's my quick aside, but I also think it's no accident that Xi Jinping talks about the Cold War in this way, because obviously it's not subtle. That's pushback against the competitive framing. It's a way of signaling to other international players that they should not get caught up in a competition, even though, like, inherently the entire world is a competition for architecture. It will determine the entire world. But if you say Cold War, you can put the blame on the US. You can make it seem like an outdated contest. And you can make the entire framing appear to be detrimental to all involved. And I mean, it's a brilliant move. It's a brilliant outsourcing of the blame. But it's also a concept that no side here should be embracing.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question and the answer. Another interesting question I just wrote is, how important are the Communist Party cells in every enterprise, in all enterprises and other institutes in China? And let me add, does it make a difference having Xi Jinping as a president in China compared to Hu Jintao before?
Yeah, I think our general read is that Xi has been able to consolidate power at a scale that wasn't quite achieved previously, and so I think that is a difference. So I think there are fewer factional pressures that are restricting a centralized and consistent approach. And then I think the environmental conditions are just different. I think that China's grown to a point and achieved a degree of dominance over a range of critical supply chains that certainly Hu did not enjoy. So she's, dealing with a stronger deck of cards and can be more assertive. And that in turn strengthens his hand in domestic politics. So I think there's sort of mutually reinforcing dynamics at play in terms of Xi is a different type of leader at a different moment. And then I think, yes, I think it's another key distinction. And I think general awareness in the West of the fact that there are party cells, alternative party decision-making apparatuses that exist within even small and medium-sized businesses in China is a key distinction that should be recognized. I don't know that we assign a great degree of intent or control by virtue of this one difference, but this distinction does support the idea that they're relative to private sector firms elsewhere in the world, that Chinese firms are centralized and responsive or can be responsive or coordinated with broader policy, and that individual decision making at the firm level carries certain types of risks in terms of domestic politics, in terms of domestic regulation, that are not quite the same elsewhere. But at the same time, we think that, like, when we look at the Made in China 2025 plan, a framing that the Chinese industrial policy system uses is to describe their economic development model as one of state-led but enterprise-driven development. So it's really, in some sense, drawing the best of a centralized model together and alongside the best of a decentralized and more meritocratic model. So we don't want to paint this as a monolith or single type of mode, because companies have party cells or party boards. But at the same time, it's certainly not the same type of free, open, ad hoc, laissez-faire economic interaction that we might see in the West.
Thank you to you for this exactly describing a situation as I view it from my point of view as well. We got another question in from concerning the technical standards. They are most often negotiated through industry bodies with where Western and Chinese companies are presented alike. How does it make sense to speak of Western versus Chinese standards? Is it a wrong frame? Do we have an answer to that?
I love this question because that's exactly right? Like, the point of these standard setting bodies is collaboratively to form international standards. And you don't see anywhere, I know because I've looked any number of times, a list in US or German sources that's like, here are all the standards the US set in the ISO this year, here's what China set. The thing is that you find that list in the Chinese sources. For example, there's an annual list that's been put out by the Chinese government the past 2 years, maybe now 3 years running, of all the China-led standards that have passed through the International Standardization Organization. And that is like the perfect example of the different framework that two different sides here are taking to standard setting. And one of them is saying this is a competitive domain. We can have Chinese-led standards, or we can have standards led by us. And the other is saying that these are collaborative. It's no one player over another. The other, just one beat farther, there's an interesting thing too about the systems themselves through which standards are set. In theory, as this question so aptly points out, the international bodies that set standards have representation from both Western and Chinese companies. In the international organizations, obviously, governments are all represented. The difference is that the Chinese system takes pains to ensure that, for example, its companies represented at an industry standard setting organization like 3GPP are all going to be following the same agenda. And there's a national working group for 3GPP that is designed to lay out what that agenda is. Then there are various accountability mechanisms to ensure that that agenda is carried out by the industry players. So while you might have free actors following their own corporate interests or sense of what the appropriate standard is, you have this block of the Chinese corporate representatives that are all following this preordained agenda, which gives them, effectively allows them to game the, in theory, democratic institutional system. And then a similar phenomenon can play out in the international organizations. There are any number of examples of China using its relationships with, for example, third-party countries. Partnerships with African countries come up a lot in these anecdotes in order to ensure that they vote for the standard China wants to win. So it's a similar idea of forming a bloc based on a degree of gamemanship to push an agenda through what in theory should be or is a democratic institution.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think that was very comprehensive. There are several other questions now getting difficult to sum them up because we are running out of time. But one question I just read out is German the useful idiot, even being proud that Chinese capital buys German tech companies? Is there any answer to that question? Are we useful idiots over here in Germany, or do we have any leverage towards China as of today?
Yeah, I think the fundamental premise here is that the problem is that China recognizes the fundamental premise as well, is that the innovative capacity and industrial strength of the German economy is why China is coming to Germany to buy startups, to develop joint ventures with legacy auto manufacturers. And those strengths are not going away in the immediate. China is also not replicating those strengths one for one. So China is not trying to innovate the same way that the German economy innovates, quite frankly. They are not. They hope that they can continue to come in and scoop up proven technologies after, you know, a company has raised X amount of money or developed X advance. So if Germany is able to protect its nascent and emerging growth sectors and impose some degree of cost or reciprocity on Chinese suitors, then yes, I think it's entirely possible. And I wouldn't even in the slightest think that the German industrial strength is a useful idiot to China. I think German capacity and strength is not disappearing and can be leveraged, but it just has to address these fundamental asymmetries in terms of how China tries to sit downstream and how China tries to approach a long-term view vice a short-term quarterly profit type.
Yeah, thank you. So we are nearly coming to the end. So I want to ask you another question I found here on the financial industry. Which impact do you see from the described development on financial industry? Because that's a really important factor we haven't mentioned before. Emily or Nathan?
Nathan, I might hand it over to you first for at least the specifics.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a range of trade agreements, investment agreement set out new rules and guardrails for financial interactions, which again are an opportunity to reset some legacy dynamics. But at the same time, the financial industry is one that we see is likely to be disrupted to some extent by emerging technologies, just as most other industries have over the past 20 years. And that's another area where we see China investing heavily to be in position for potential leapfrogs. So fintech would be an area where Germany is well positioned to build on its legacy strength as a banking and finance power within Europe and globally to take steps toward incremental advance and to continue in the technological developments that, you know, we think might shape disruptions from fintech. But they I think there's a need at this moment in particular to be protective of potential risks of falling prey to and feeding into China's leapfrog orientation. So I think that financial flows and capital flows to and from China present risks that are latent relative to other places. So China uses capital to have access to technology. China leverages capital to have influence in in foreign markets. So I think, you know, failings of the recent comprehensive agreement on investment, for example, would be not addressing those types of latent risks and setting up the financial sector for potential co-option or support of China's leapfrog orientation, which I think, like, the way we think about the auto sector maps on fairly well to the way that we think about the financial sector is how I'd frame it.
Anything to add from your side, Emily?
I think that well summed it up. Just the other beat that this is, you know, going to the much more abstract that I think we like to lay out too is with the, you know, fintech, the digital currency domain. The distinction you see between, and this goes back to the idea of the old architecture being formed in the 20th century, the new of the 21st, between, for example, currency advantages as they currently exist, but then what comes from the, you know, new type version of that advantage, which is controlling the channels of payment in a fintech world. And not only is that a potential leapfrog, but it's one that grants a new kind of power, because fintech, digital currency, that entails also collecting not only having an advantage in every transaction from less friction, but also potentially being able to collect information on those transactions, which is, you know, has any amount of value to be redeemed. So all of this is to say, you know, dittoing Nate's framing, and there's this additional analytical question, which is, what is the new kind of power, leverage, influence that you can derive from this new financial sector competition that is different from what predated it.
Thank you. There popped up a last question. It's a very last question on artificial intelligence. So what is the framework to engage with Chinese players from both sides, the CCP and the private enterprise, that are not absolutely under CCP control? For example, Alibaba. Do you see there any development that private enterprises in China can do their own business, as I would say?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would probably rely on this concept of state-led, enterprise-driven. I think that the state is very happy to allow its private sector and businesses to proceed on their own business within certain boundaries to start and at certain times. So when it's in the interest of the state, I think firms are given a long leash and allowed to engage as they see fit. But I think given the nature of China's industrial policy ecosystem, which is to say the volume of subsidies that even the most private of firms that exist in China and the degree of party integration with the private sector, these fundamental dynamics mean that there are risks that the Chinese state will rein back in actors or at critical moments will try to influence or shape them. I don't think that we have a sound or logical explanation for the disappearance of Jack Ma for some number of months this past year, from either from his company or from him or from the Chinese government. But I think that it's possible that stands as a very telling example of the degree to which the Chinese state can exert influence. I don't think that it constantly does, but I think that it's a constant latent feature of doing business with China that's quite different from doing business elsewhere in the world.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think it's now time for the closing remarks because we are running out of time. So once again, thanks a lot, Emily and Nathan, for sharing with us your ideas and thoughts on that really important topic. And I wish you all the best for your research in that area. And I hope that we have an opportunity to meet personally next time and to continue discussion, because I think there are a lot of war stories we can tell each other from the last 20 years in China doing business over there. And yeah, it's a pity that I haven't seen anybody from the audience. I would like to see the audience next time in person, and then we can actually continue discussing, having a beer or something, a nice wine. And so the whole framework for such a discussion is a little bit missing. And of course, thanks a lot from me to Molly and Isaac for giving us the opportunity and the framework for the discussion. I wish you all a brilliant, nice evening, and hope to see you again in person. Bye-bye.